All right, welcome everybody to the newest installment of the Draft on Tap. Little video did not play. That's my fault. That's okay. We'll just get straight into it here. Episode 4, Season 2. Our guest today is Matt Waldman. Matt, how are you today?
I'm doing great. We don't need any pretense for this show. We can just get it rolling, right? You know?
That's right. Let's see. Let's start right off with this, Matt. A whole bunch of new changes to Commander's Land. Let's start first with the head coach. It wasn't exactly who I think they wanted. I think if we're all fair on this thing, and that's okay. But what are your initial reactions to Dan Quinn and Washington? Not necessarily, I think, the offensive. Obviously, not an offensive guy. I think a lot of people thought they'd go offensive type guy.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm down here in Atlanta. Dan Quinn certainly is familiar to a lot of Atlantans and certainly had some success, and certainly, or at least had inherited a team that had some success. And he had success as a defensive coordinator, obviously in Seattle. When they had the Legion of Boom, he was a big part of that as well. So I like on the one hand that a lot of people complain about retreads, but I think that when you have some good coordinators, they have an opportunity to learn from some of the mistakes that they have, because being a strategic person when it comes to game plan or coaching a unit is one thing. Delegating and managing the talent that you have around you, including other coaches, is a whole other ball of wax. So I'm more in favor of the idea that you give some guys maybe a second chance or a second opportunity to do that as a coach. And Quinn was a guy that players liked working for. They respected him. I think that what he knows with the defensive side of the ball can be helpful. So and I think he's the type of guy that will probably allow his offensive minds to do what they need to do. I don't think he's going to interfere in a way that, you would look like a Jerry Glanville, who was more of a defensive coach way back in the day, who would try, or the Ryans, and kind of meddle their way into things that would, maybe not allow their offensive coaches to do what they do best.
And we use that as a segue. You talk about offensive minds. It was interesting. They landed on Cliff Kingsbury. It was odd for this cycle, right? I mean, Kingsbury and Chip Kelly, two names I did not expect to hear a ton of, were like the big names in the cycle. It sounds like Chip Kelly will get a job, maybe out in Seattle on the Donald staff. Are you surprised about these two names? And in particularly, what are your thoughts about Kingsbury's in a role where all he has to do is offensive stuff?
Yeah, and I think that that's a good thing for him, because you're going to hear a lot of the detractors. Obviously, you all probably already have heard it. One is the joke that he only lines his top receiver up on one side of the field, and that Devontae Adams probably raised a stink at the idea of that. And you look at the quarterbacks, and you're going to hear criticisms about, well, they had Patrick Mahomes at Texas Tech with Cliff Kingsbury, and they had losing records, or they had Caleb Williams, and he's there to help as a consultant. And now Caleb Williams played well 2 seasons ago, but now under Cliff Kingsbury, he's earning criticism about his game, or Kyler Murray, and that they didn't get along towards the end, and that he kind of fell up in the Peter principle with Manziel and the Manziel media when he started, and then has kind of worked his way up in that fashion. Now, there's probably some justification, there's probably some validity to certain issues that you could say with Kingsbury, but when you look at what he does offensively, he's actually a pretty creative guy, and what he's known for is adjusting his scheme to be quarterback friendly to the quarterback that they get. So he's a good for young quarterbacks. Patrick Mahomes just came out today, if you want to listen to that, and he'll say, and if he's going to say anything, he said, I think it's a good hire. He helped me a lot. I learned a ton from Cliff Kingsbury, making the transition there. So maybe they didn't win, but you got to remember, Texas Tech is basically a mid-level, Power Five team that is going to recruit a ton of great players. So they're not going to have great defensive athletes. And the college game is, we can talk about scheme all we want, but really the schemes have to be fairly simple so that you play the athletes, and the athletes have to do their, you can talk about Alabama scheme or Georgia scheme and some of the little tricky things that they do on certain levels. But really, at the end of the day, they get the top athletes because they can't practice more than a certain number of hours a week, and to get them really complex at what the scheme could do, say, in the NFL. So, Kingsbury was always faced with that. So there's some things I like about Kingsbury overall is that his run game is actually better than people realize. They think of him as a spread guy because of his Texas Tech days. But if you look at what they did in Arizona, he had a lot of good run concepts where maybe they used unbalanced formations, putting two or three tight ends to one side. They would do some imaginative things with pulling tackles and tight ends in ways that you didn't always quite expect wrinkle-wise. And James Conner revitalized his career after the Steelers basically saying, we're done with you. And I remember watching James Conner last year and going, this guy can still play. The Steelers are just kind of scapegoating him with a bad offensive line. And it's not so much scapegoating as that he was due for a second contract and they didn't want to pay him a premium when they could get a younger guy and they didn't have an O-line. Well, I mean, he's looked good over the past few years when he's been healthy. And with Brian Robinson, who's a good gap runner, and a versatile player and has really established himself as one of the bright spots of the Commanders organization on offense, he's going to be a good fit with what Kingsbury likes to do. He's very much a James Conner-like running back when you think about the comparison. Big, good feet, quicker than you'd expect. More agile than you would expect. Maybe not a burner with speed, but he can catch. And so he can run zone or gap, but gap is really like going to be his wheelhouse. So what Kingsbury does on that end is nice. And maybe too, if now that he is not having to delegate and be the front-facing person in the media and having to deal with different coaches and personalities and all of that, and he can focus on the one thing that he was always good at. He can be a little bit more imaginative, do a little bit more from the wrinkle standpoint. And also if Quinn's like, listen, man, I know this is what you like to do, but what have you learned from the criticisms of your game, and are they valid or are they not? And if he said, I can be a little more imaginative with disguising things with shifts in motion. But at the same time, you got to look at the quarterbacks you have. And I'm not I'll just end this way. I've never been a big Kyler Murray fan. He's a very athletic player who can throw the ball well, but he is one of the worst quarterbacks from the pocket with skill that I've seen. Like when you watch Kyler Murray, you see that what he mostly does is he buys a lot of time in the pocket, but it's from running from spot to spot. I don't care if you're unbelievably mobile, because Patrick Mahomes is unbelievably mobile. He doesn't just run from spot to spot. He can move incrementally like Tom Brady moved incrementally. The best quarterbacks move incrementally because they can see what's going on downfield as they're moving, and they don't have to take their eyes off of their receivers, which means their receivers don't have to reroute. And it means that they don't run past their line's containment and put more stress on their line. Kyler Murray's basically he's like Frogger, like that old video game Frogger, where he's like hopping from spot to spot so he doesn't get hit by the car, rather than seeing where the path actually could be that's most efficient for him to get from A to Z with the ball. And sometimes that shows up on ESPN as an 8-second scramble, but most of the time it cost him victories. And there was some kind of conflict between those two towards the end. And I would have to imagine part of it is Kyler, you're going to have to develop your game. This doesn't quite work the way we want it to. And, this isn't out in the media, but I have to imagine you can intuit that from looking at what they wanted Kyler to do and having the clause in the contract they did about studying film and working at your craft a little bit more. This is a guy who leans on his athletic ability with diminishing returns. So Cliff Kingsbury knew him well, and knew him probably well enough to say, hey, man, your game's got to get better. I've been with you since the beginning. Your game's got to get better than this, because there's only so much that we can do with you otherwise. And I think that So when you look at the motion part of it, I think that probably with a different quarterback who is a student of the game to a higher degree than maybe Kyler has been, and Kyler's known to blame people. He points a finger at other people. So if you have a quarterback who's different than that, you're probably going to wind up with a more complex offense that you don't have to dumb down. Because living in Atlanta here, I've watched Arthur Smith, and people get mad about Arthur Smith going to Pittsburgh and what he did in Atlanta and how they had all this wasted talent. But, watching them the past 2 years, I watched immediately and I go, okay, so why are they running all these static routes in Atlanta that just terminate at one point and they don't break across zones? Well, it's because you have a quarterback in Desmond Ridder that I scouted at Cincinnati who couldn't read the field well enough to decide when to throw the ball and when not to if there were multiple points of defenders in coverage where you had to read the leverage quickly, and he couldn't discern it. So Arthur Smith had to simplify the routes on a level to fit what Desmond Ridder did, and he had to take the heat for that because Desmond Ridder never developed and never got better than that. So, of course, if you're not having receivers break across formation and they terminate on stops and hooks and curls, and now they got to restart again, and your quarterback isn't a quick enough processor of the game, your offense looks bad. So I don't think you're going to see that in Washington. And if you do, he's probably going to have a short tenure there.
It had to have been frustrating for a guy like Cliff, where we now have some of the reports of the 10,000 rule. If the guy was in there studying film at 4:30 in the morning, and you got Kyler Murray who doesn't exactly like to study it, it had to have been infuriating.
Yes, and that's what happens with a lot of players. I mean, my buddy Cecil Lammy, who covers the Broncos, I mean, he certainly talked about in years past, about, I'll give you two examples. One is a public one he made, and one's, now we've been far enough past it, we can go kind of private, but like Paxton Lynch, who was a first-round pick, Lee Steinberg had him, the agent, and, big arm, could throw it a mile, tall kid, there were a lot of people that liked him, but he was not a great processor of the game at that point, and he needed work, but he liked to play video games, and he spent more time playing video games. And Trevor Siemian was, meanwhile, Northwestern kid, was at the facility working his tail off, and so was Chad Kelly, for that matter, who just, was just kind of a head case off the field, but on the field was unbelievable, and you can see why in the CFL. So there's that. And then Drew Lock, a recent draft pick like that. I remember watching him, and people were making soft comparisons or light comparisons to Patrick Mahomes because of some of the throws he would make. And I go, this guy, you can see from his game that when he faced mid-level SEC teams, he could win. He had the arm talent and the physical skills to do that. When he faced the Bamas, the Floridas, the Georgias, the LSUs, he struggled because those teams forced him to do things that he couldn't do, which were execute in a fundamentally sound fashion, and not just wing it. And that, you can't just, like, as a quarterback, you just can't snap into that. You actually have to build a foundation of working like that every day. And the winging it arm kind of off script stuff, yeah, you can practice some of that and you can be naturally good at that. But those are the plays that get on ESPN that you say, oh, plays of the week, but your team is, 7 and 10, as opposed to being a team that's fundamentally sound and being 11 and 6, and that's the difference. And so he always looked like the guy that got enabled because teams, they probably said, you don't need look, Drew, you're great, but these are things you're going to have to work on for the pros because you're not going to get away with that. And they're not going to say this out loud, but we're happy with you because you're the one high caliber player we could get at quarterback at Missouri. So we're not going to bench you. You're winning enough games for us to stay here as coaches because the pressure is different than it is at Georgia or Florida or Alabama, so that's fine. But when you get the pros, you got to do this. So he got to the pros, and apparently Peyton Manning called him up and said, hey, anything you need from me, let me know. Now, if you're a quarterback who's driven, you're like, can I live in your garage, watch your cars, and babysit your kids whenever you need to while you go out so that I can basically learn everything that I need to know from you? learn everything that I need to know. And he didn't do that. He said thanks and then moved on. And then the third year, Teddy Bridgewater's brought in basically to be the guy to compete with him. And he calls Peyton Manning up and starts getting coaching. It's too late at that point. So the dad, Drew Lock's dad, basically was telling my friend, my buddy Cecil and colleague Cecil was like, listen, he said, I've been telling Drew since high school. I love my son. He's a good kid. He's a good, smart kid. But I've been telling him since high school, hey, when the coaches say you need to work on this stuff, you might need to spend some extra time to work on these things. It's like, I'll get to it later, or he just nod and kind of do his thing, just like a lot of good young kids do, who just aren't mature enough to understand the opportunity that was in front of them. And he said, yeah, so I know. He never really listened because people told him, but he just thought, I'll get to it when I get to the NFL, because everyone else nobody needed to discipline him that level. So quarterback development's that way. So when you look at Kingsbury, the big thing is, can you get a quarterback who's going to get in here and has that mentality to work his tail off? Because if you do that, Kingsbury can take his offense to another level. If you don't, he's going to be playing, nursemaid and patch up work to a guy that the organization has invested a lot of money in, and they're not going to come off him that easily. They're going to come off you, Cliff Kingsbury, first. They're going to come off the coach probably second, and then they're going to come off the quarterback third, even though it shouldn't be that way.
Let's get into this. Is there a specific, I see all the time now, Cliff Kingsbury's coming to town. We got to get a specific quarterback that fits him specifically. Do you buy into that notion?
No, but I understand the narrative. I understand the narrative of like, okay, you got to get Caleb. We got to trade, we got to trade with the Bears and get Caleb Williams, or maybe we got to get Justin Fields from the Bears and use him as a reclamation project, which I don't mind that idea. I think he's a better quarterback. The Bears, that's another story, and we can get into that if we want to. But, either way that they go, certainly with Kingsbury, and because he came from a spread air raid system, people like to think we need a quarterback who can move and run and create on the move. And certainly that can be beneficial. And you can do a lot with your run concepts also, where if you can have like pullers, but also have like a read option for your quarterback baked into that Kingsbury is very good at that. But Jared Goff came from an air raid offense. And I know that some people like poo-poo Jared Goff, but of all the quarterbacks that are in that class, he's still the one that's playing at a high level, or a high enough level to be a part of a good team. And it wasn't him that cost them that NFC championship, if you really look at it, more than, overall. So, I think for them, they just need a quarterback who can process quickly, who can play well in the pocket, regardless of whether he moves well on or off structure. The other stuff is a bonus, and that he works and that really sees the field. And processing is the thing that's, the thing that makes Patrick Mahomes special at its core isn't the crazy arm throws, isn't the great movement and flexibility. All of that makes him even greater. But if Patrick Mahomes were basically Tom Brady in athletic ability, he'd still be great, because when he sees the opening and he anticipates it, which is what a lot of quarterbacks don't do well, he anticipates the opening and the ball comes out as soon as it comes on, as soon as his back foot hits, or as soon as he sees it. And that's the difference between an Alex Smith, who y'all had, who the Chiefs had, who I always joke was the great academic of quarterbacks. If he's like, he reads the whiteboard great, he understands football at a high level, he's tough, but he needed 2 to 3 hops or hitches, basically, to confirm what he already saw. Like the economist who basically knew that the recession is going on, but needs the data to confirm it 2 years later. Instead, in football, you need someone who's the operations manager going, we know there's something wrong here. We can't confirm academically what it is, but we got to get ahead of this so that we don't lose our business, and that's what you need out of a quarterback. And those guys, if you can be, CJ Stroud is another great example of that. The ball immediately comes out and it's placed where it needs to be, as opposed to Desmond Ridder, who needed a second or third hitch to decide, and at that point got hit or had to throw it out of bounds or had to run. And there are most quarterbacks who get drafted in the first round, it's a 50-50 split. The ones who are like Ridder and Smith, that's your range. The ones who are better than that, Mahomes is your upside, is your ceiling.
You mentioned Caleb Williams. What about May and Daniels as far as fits in the air raid? Because I know it's not always easy to project, but that's going to be the discussion. Because I'm with you. I don't think Caleb Williams is going to be there. I think they're going to choose between those two. What is your impression of both of them as far as processing, able to be adaptable to something like the air raid modified offense that we should be seeing?
I think Jaden Daniels is a good fit. I also think Bo Nix would be a good fit. I think both those guys actually process the field pretty well for college players. I think Daniels, his processing is a little less proven in the sense of I haven't seen enough instances of processing downfield that would make me as comfortable with him as I'd like to be. But I think that I've seen enough to say there's potential there to build on for that. With Drake May, I am not a fan of Drake May. So I'll just say that it's very possible that I'm just crazy and wrong. I've been wrong certainly before and often. I've been doing this 19 years. You're going to have your misses. But Drake May, to me, his decision-making, his sense of pressure, he is big, he's strong, he can take a hit. Like Sam Howell, like Mitchell Trubisky, both from North Carolina, and I don't usually logo scout. But my buddy Brandon Angelo does make a good point that teams do, those college teams do recruit a type sometimes. And in recent years, the recruiting, when you look at that, big, strong, athletic guys, he can certainly make big throws, but identifying pressure in a timely manner is a little bit of an issue with him. His ability to identify when to make the throw and to throw the ball accurately with pinpoint accuracy, which you don't see that. Like when you hear PFF or some other organization say Baker Mayfield had the best accuracy, one of the best accuracy rates in college, that's great. But when you're actually charting the games, and I know they chart, but like one of the things that I specialize in in my past life that I applied to this life is actually building processes and reducing variation in how you monitor or evaluate performance. And one of those things is that there can be a lot of variation in how somebody sees what's pinpoint and what's not. Because you could, and Bill Walsh even talked about that way back in the day. Because there's a famous interview with him where Mike Holmgren said, I learned about accuracy from Bill Walsh when I'm watching Joe Montana throw a pass to Jerry Rice in practice. And I go, great pass, great throw, Joe. And Bill Walsh pulled me aside and lectured me for about 5 minutes to say, that throw was not pinpoint accurate for that route. This is what I'm looking for with pinpoint accuracy. This is where it needs to be. You have to consider the route. You have to consider the coverage. You have to consider where you want the throw to be to avoid that. Sometimes a throw that doesn't look pinpoint because it's back shoulder or a leaping throw or only where the receiver can catch it, where they have to make a big adjustment, can be pinpoint, even though the onus is on the receiver. So are those things being applied to when you're studying Baker Mayfield? And I can tell you as a Browns fan growing, that when I watch Baker Mayfield, I'm like, that's Jeff Garcia at his best. He's going to be Jeff Garcia at Jeff Garcia's best. He's not going to be Brett Favre, who he was being compared to, and that was a big reason why. So Drake May, I'm worried about. If they get Drake May, I would be worried. I don't think, I think physically, school reputation, all the bullet points that teams use to cover their assets about players, which is athletic ability, stats, interviews, football knowledge, wins, losses, size, dimensions, all that, he's a first round pick. In
Right.
terms of processing information, how you would see it in film, not the S2, but like actually what you study on film. I think he's a reserve player, and aspiring to be a reserve player. I think he's the guy that I'd be most worried about.
I think it would be a little surprising too that we haven't seen it too many times, but the Heisman winner slip into what, the third quarterback or even farther. So I'm with you. I watched both of them, but I just think I hear a lot of the RG3 comparisons to Daniels. I find it a little lazy with some of the running stuff. I guess like it was some of the north-south stuff I can see because he's definitely no Lamar Jackson. But I'm with you. I think he's the kind of guy that he's a journeyman. You know, the Arizona State background coming. I think that's a knock on him. Which I don't think it's a knock.
No.
I think you want to see a prospect just get better and better. And over the 2 years, I think that's where Daniel is. I think he's just ascending, getting better every day.
I think that's a great point because also you have to understand that being a journeyman now in the NIL era is a lot different than being a journeyman like 15 years ago.
Right.
Yeah, there's no doubt. And speaking of journeyman, I'm curious your thoughts on it. You mentioned Bo Nix, and I've got a lot of friends, and we've got people coming on the show who are continuing to tell me about Bo Nix, and I guess I just can't get Auburn Bo Nix out of my brain.
Me too.
And I don't want any parts of Auburn Bo Nix. But Adam, you know, I mean, we have people coming weekly on the show on every Wednesday saying you got to go back and look at the Oregon because the Oregon Bo Nix is way different than the Auburn Bo Nix. Is that him learning, or is that a product of the system?
That's a great question, and it's a little bit of both. But I would say the important things are why people are telling you to go back and watch him because I live in the SEC country, so I saw Bo Nix at Auburn quite a bit, and you have to understand that what happened at what you see at Oregon is certainly they throw a lot of RPOs. And so the efficiency is going to be high and the stats look great and people get worried about that. But when you watch him create, you actually do see him process information downfield pretty well because they're not always throwing RPOs. It's just the sample size of the legit passes that you want to see that are going to make a difference is a little lower than what you would see, maybe with certain other quarterbacks. But, I've seen him move well in the pocket. I've seen him do a pretty good job of, placing the ball where he needs to on the move, but doing it in an efficient way in the pocket. I've seen some of those creative solutions at Auburn too. It's just that the offense was a bit of a mess. It's a bit predictable. I mean, Auburn has a great defense, but their offensive system has always been a little bit on the, on the predictable side. So I think Nix was kind of hamstrung by his offense at Auburn more than it was that he was boosted up by his Oregon offense. That's probably maybe a better way might be my spin doctoring way of doing it. That sounds really good.
No, I'll tell you, weekly we got people saying, no, I'm telling you, Bo Nix is going to squeak up draft boards.
And I think he is because now I have him at a grade right now. He is my number 2 quarterback right now on my board. Now, yes, but I will say that I'm not as impressed with this quarterback class as some people are. Yeah. Now, Caleb Williams is far and away number 1, and I think he'd be the number 1 in most classes that we've seen. If not pretty close, it would be.
No chance Chicago doesn't take him.
I doubt it. I doubt they don't.
I'm with you.
Yeah. So they got Williams, but then there's a pretty good tier break. And Williams is and to me, Nix is in that range where Nix and Daniels, and you could probably make arguments for some of the other guys like McCarthy and Penix and Radler. And if you're really a Drake May guy and see something differently than me, you're going to put him in there. But those are all guys that I think you probably need them. They need a year. You need to keep Brissett. If you're going to keep Howell, Brissett or Howell can kind of compete there. And then, I would probably say it'd be more Brissett, from the standpoint of like, if you want to have him be the mentor, you're going to keep both of those guys and have Brissett be the mentor a little bit and give them a year or a part of the year and give them intermittent playing time. A little bit of time, a quarter here, a series there. Maybe they start to give them a little bit more work. And if it doesn't work out, where they're having a bad game, bench them, give them some time to obsess, and then put them back in. Now we know that's probably not going to all happen, but
Right.
it would be that's the ideal. That's how Breeze got it done. That's how, that's how it worked for him. That's how a lot of old school quarterbacks actually developed. Steve McNair got it that way. I just mentioned two guys who were MVP caliber players if they didn't win, at all. So, that would be nice, but those guys need that a little bit more. I think if there's a guy in this class, though, who could hit the ground and we go, it's going to be rough, maybe for the first year, and then maybe we'll start to see some improvement and we'll have some hope. It would be Bo Nix. I think Nix is the closest one. Daniel's probably after that, but Nix I'm a little more confident in, and I think he's maybe a half a tier higher than Daniels. And I would say those are the guys that I hope the Commanders target as opposed to May.
It feels like there's this huge swell Commanders going quarterback at 2. There is another contingency, albeit small, in Commander land that says just stick with mostly Howell, but let's stick with the guy and take these 5 draft picks we have early and fill out the roster. And if it doesn't work, then we'll worry about we'll kick quarterback down the road, or we'll have picked up an extra first and moved down a little bit and take a tackle. Where are you on having to get the quarterback now? And I'll just ask you where you were on Sam Howell. I think I remember, but just remind me where you were on Sam Howell before we started.
I thought Sam Howell was kind of in that Baker Mayfield tier, like a player who could give you competent starter skill with great surrounding talent, but he's not the guy who's going to, carry the offense. That's at least not for the first 6 to 8 years of his career, if he has a starting career that long, in that capacity. I'm with that minority of people that say you don't need to get the quarterback. Because I'm a belief that if you build a team that's good enough, the quarterback will come. If you don't draft him, there'll be a free agent that goes, I want to play with the Commanders. They have a strong offensive line. They've got strong skill talent around it. They just need me, And I mean, certainly the Colts hoped to have that, but they didn't quite pick the best quarterbacks to do it, and they didn't have the market for it. But you see that with enough teams that I mean, it worked to a limited extent with Kansas City. It worked for an extent with the Broncos, with Peyton. It worked for Tampa Bay. So this is one of those scenarios that I think you have players who in the next 3 to 5 years in the league who probably are going to age to the point where you go, yeah, we can do this. Or even if a year or two. I know people hate Aaron Rodgers from a public opinion standpoint. I don't really care about public opinion about what they do on or off the field. All I care is if they're professionals. Aaron Rodgers might be able to play another year or two. And maybe it won't be in New York. Maybe Washington's at that point where you go, okay, we could do this for a year or two. We got these young draft picks. And he can help gel this team fast, or a Kirk Cousins, if he heals sufficiently enough, he can come back and make his return here as the prodigal son. Nobody expected to be the prodigal son, but there are opportunities like that. Cause I like Brock Purdy, but he's a great example of a player who is better than what people think, but we know that he's not, to carry the team on his back guy. So to me, use those picks wisely. And if you can't get Caleb Williams, I would say in this draft, I would say if Bo Nix slides to you in the second round, if one of these quarterbacks slide to you in the second round or the third round, sure, do it. Build your infrastructure.
If they don't go quarterback, let's start talking about some of the other position groupings then. If we're not talking about quarterback at 2, would the intrigue for Marvin Harrison Jr. be so big that you have to take wide receiver at 2? Where is he so much better than the tackle prospects? Because in Washington, we're dying for a tackle. We've got to have a tackle, but you continue to hear just about how good the kid out of Ohio State is. What are your thoughts there?
No, I think you need to tackle. I'll say that, I like Marvin Harrison. I would even go far to say I'm borderline in love with what Marvin Harrison can do for you, but I don't think he's the best wide receiver in this class. So yep, I'm a Malik Neighbors guy, and I think it's not even close.
Wow.
And when I say that, if you take Marvin Harrison and you put him in a T. Higgins-esque Mike Williams type of role, he's closer to that, in my opinion, than AJ Green. Now, can he be what people see in T. Higgins and Mike Williams as like, oh yeah, if you're on a different team, he'd be the number one? I think maybe he's a little closer to that. He could be in that regard, but he's a very good player who's going to start immediately, who can give you, contested catch skills that are going to excite people. He is a good route runner. He is not a great route runner just yet. He is a good route runner. He is not as sudden as Malik Neighbors. He is not as skilled against press or running the routes that you would run as a primary receiver, the timing routes that Malik Neighbors can run. Malik Neighbors can make the tough catches at contact that Marvin Harrison can. And also, Malik Neighbors doesn't drop the ball due to certain tracking skills that Marvin Harrison lacks a little bit in specific scenarios that usually you would look for from a primary receiver. Marvin Harrison oftentimes goes up for the ball to attack it with underhand position on targets where you need overhand attack, and he waits until the ball is already past him to make catches that he should attack at the earliest point. Now, I'm not saying it's going to cost him his career or anything crazy like that. He's a terrific prospect. If you get him over Neighbors, you'll still be happy with him. But Malik Neighbors is, to me, Malik Neighbors is more of what Odell Beckham, healthy and early Giants career could be. More what maybe Justin Jefferson or AJ trying to remember the receiver. The receiver out of Pittsburgh.
Chase. Yeah. Jamar Chase.
No, yeah, well, Chase maybe. No, but the one out of from Central Michigan who walked on Central Michigan, was a star and was with Brady and then walked off the field.
Yeah. Brown.
Antonio Brown. I keep wanting to say AJ, and I know it's not AJ. Yeah, and he's got a little Antonio Brown in him, and I mean that in a good way, not in the unfortunate ways that it.
You're on his way to the Hall of Fame.
Antonio Brown. Right. Yeah. So, Harrison's a nice player, but I already think you have that in Terry McLaurin, and what Terry McLaurin does well. And McLaurin, to me, I always make fun of it, and I do it with admiration. Terry McLaurin is like the bumblebee of the NFL, because the bumblebee, you look at them and go, they have no business being able to fly. Like technically, they have no business being able to do that. And when you watch him catch a football, his attack, there are 3 players I've seen in football over the past 20 years who can attack a football as poorly technically as he does and come down with it every time. And he's the best at it of those 3. I just look at it. I mean, I missed on him completely because of that. Because I just was like, it's not going to fly in the NFL. I've seen, it's like Early Doucette and Golden Tate are the 2 other guys I've studied who've done this. And if Golden Tate is like the high water mark, then I'll take the risk on saying that I have to see it to believe it. And I've seen it enough to have total admiration for him. But he's a good boundary player who makes tough catches over the middle, but Neighbors can give you a little bit more of the even more flexibility than McLaurin can in certain ways. And I think that it opens up your offense and what you can do. Whereas with Marvin Harrison, I feel like you got to stick him in 1 or 2 spots, and it's good, and it'll be really good, but not quite as flexible as what you could get.
With all the 7-on-7, I feel like it's because of the emergence of 7-on-7. It feels like there are more and more wide receivers that go in the first round every year. Is that just happenstance, or this is a trend going forward, and we're just going to? And what does that do for the receivers that are already in the league?
Yeah, I mean, well, it certainly heightens the level of competition that's going to be available, and it means that you have to be a very flexible player who can play. More players to stick in the league at a high level means that they're probably going to have to play all three positions very well, slot, flanker, and split end, and be able to do at least two of those three and be versatile. I would also say you're going to see careers be shorter and that's something that my colleague Adam Harstead on my podcast at the RSP Cast I've talked about, that we're seeing that he's seeing careers get shorter now, like in terms of being high-end starters, and that we're seeing that end with certain positions, and wide receiver is one of those. Defensive back is another one. But wide receiver, so it's one, you can be cheaper as an ownership and an executive office when you can keep getting younger talent that's ready. And because you're playing these spread offenses more, and they're being featured more and being used in different ways, and there's more training that goes into wide receiver play now at a level that hasn't been in the past. There has been an anticipation in the scouting community for the past 5 years that these receivers would be more technically sound coming out than what we've seen in recent years, like as a whole.
Well, let me ask you, in the scenario that a lot of fans are hoping, in a Washington trade back, say 5-6 slots down, top 10, does a guy like Brock Bowers really switch the needle for a franchise, rebuilding, new coach, would that be something that you would think would be in play?
Yeah, and I like the idea. I mean, Bowers is a move tight end. We know this. He's more in that Laporta style than he is George Kittle or Rob Gronkowski, though he's technically sound as a blocker for his size. You just know that a 270-pound freak of a defensive end, if he's facing Chase Young, we know that Chase Young is going to destroy him. That's just that we know that's the case. But you're not asking him to do that kind of stuff on a regular basis. He's going to be more like he's going to be an elite athletic version of Chris Cooley, basically. That's what you're getting, who you can move around, you can use as a fullback out of the backfield, more Aaron Hernandez, Chris Cooley, kind of in that range. And I think that's a very helpful to a team, especially one like what Cliff Kingsbury would likely build, which is multiple tight ends. Right. He can be the second tight end. We know that we've got the kind of the constraint play built into what we do. So if we pull, he can be that lead blocker and be very good. If we do play action, he can be that lead blocker and then match up against a bewildered linebacker and win the ball. Or if he gets matched up against a safety who's pretty good, that's okay, because if we have the quarterback, he'll target him tight and he'll probably win it, in that tight range. We can also use him, and we can find ways to use him in multiple ways, because you have some nice young tight ends from a potential standpoint to be weekly parts of your roster, but not like top end starter talents. Like that kid Turner out of Nevada. Yeah, he's certainly lengthy, can catch the ball really well. I'm a fan of what he can be as a role player, and maybe develop down the line into a starter, but he's not a dynamic blocker. He doesn't move unbelievably well outside of a short space of like catch radius, right. Not route running, So you get more with Brock Bowers. You get yourself a player if that happens, and I think he'd fit well with what they want to do, run game and passing game.
The other name that I hear a lot going in the first couple of rounds is the tight end from Texas, Sanders. What is the gap that you have between Sanders and Brock Bowers?
Unfortunately, he's still a guy that I have to finish studying. So I would say that my answer probably won't be sufficient enough to give you a gap there. Now, I will say, if you want to wait a year, and a player that I have studied is Eric All, the former
Iowa.
Michigan from Iowa.
Yeah.
And that guy's an underrated player.
Really like him.
He can win the ball. You got to block at both of those schools. So he's technically sound. You can see that with him. And while he's not like Sam Laporta as a pass catcher, as a route runner, he's a good pass catcher with some skills after the catch, who I would say, Jordan Reed certainly I didn't think was a fantastic route runner coming out compared to Laporta. Like he wasn't bad, but he wasn't Laporta as a route runner, but very good after the catch. And I would say he's not Jordan Reed, but he's closer. If Jordan Reed is the destination, this kid's probably like a couple streets down in the same zip code,
Let's wrap up with some of the O-line stuff. It's like a pick your poison, it feels like, with the first two guys. Do you have a preference? And then how many do you think end up going in the first round? Good year to meet an offensive lineman in the draft.
Yeah, like that's not my specialty, obviously, because with what I do is the skill positions.
Yeah.
But from what I hear, and if you haven't, I will recommend this. I'll recommend this up front. If you don't have Brandon Thorne on, and if you don't seek out Brandon Thorne, go seek out Brandon. Brandon's a colleague, obviously does great work. But I would say it sounds like a strong class. And I would say that for really, you just lean on Kingsbury, I would say, to an extent, Kingsbury and your own line coach to fit on what they want to do offensively with their scheme. I would think that you want a tackle who's probably very good at pulling, because that's what they do. So you want a guy who can pull and be versatile on that standpoint, and a power running game. Right. So you want the athlete. You're looking for you're looking at the most upside as an athlete, but to be careful at the point that where you don't go all athlete and sacrifice, the technical skills that need to be there.
Quickly, with guys like Jacobs hitting the market and Barkley, is this the last hurrah for running backs getting second contracts?
Sadly.
Will it be the zoo show out in Las Vegas now?
It might be, but we'll see. I still think that a great running back can make a difference, but it's a tough thing to quantify, because the quantification methods of doing that are so limited and myopic in terms of how they really study running backs. But Henry and Barkley and Jacobs, fantastic running backs who can make a difference, I would say, especially to me, Jacobs and Henry. I like Barkley, but I think he needs a little bit reining in sometimes as a decision maker. He's the best athlete of the three, but he probably is the least mature as a decision maker of the three. I think it probably will be that way for now. We're going to have to see a change in how defenses play to really emphasize the running game again. And it's not just, and we've seen some of that with cover two. I mean, they've run more. Michael Lopez, the stat researcher, has already shown in the past 2 years that we've run more and more efficiently than any time in the past 10 years over these past two. But nonetheless, it's still a quarterback game. That's where they're trying to rule everything. And running backs don't play hurt to the way they did before. And that's probably a good thing for humanity, but it's probably not an exciting thing for the game. So yeah, I think the era is ending, sad to say.
The rookie scouting portfolio is out by April 1st. Is that right?
Every year since 2006. So you can get it at mattwaldman.com. If you want to learn more about it, you can go to my YouTube channel, Matt Waldman's RSP Film Room, where I have probably over 700 videos and podcasts up, but a lot of videos working, doing video analysis. You can find me on Twitter at Matt Waldman, and I'm doing video breakdowns every day. Be a part of the book. It's is one of the 2 most purchased draft guides by NFL people like scouts, according to folks like Alex Brown, who's the head of recruiting at SMU, who visits with these guys weekly and sees what they use to cross-check their work. So I'm very proud of that as someone who just studies quarterback, wide receiver, tight end, and running back. I study at least 150 players at that position, and my process is very in-depth, and you will be pleasantly shocked when you see it. MattWaldman.com is where you can find it.
Absolutely. And then revised right after the draft too. Also, it am I not mistaken that you're partnered up with a charity too that proceeds from
I do. I've been donating to a charity called Darkness to Light. D2L.org is where you can learn more about it. Since around the Joe Paterno, Jerry Sandusky, really I should say it's the Jerry Sandusky scandal, but Paterno knew about it. So the thing is yeah, it's an organization devoted to training adults on how to not only spot and identify situations that could lead to sexual abuse of children and prevent it, but also when it is reported and not prevented, on how to handle it in a way that doesn't compound the trauma for the victims. And and they've worked with Penn State, they've worked with Michigan State, they've worked with individuals and civic organizations. It's probably one of the most rampant and least talked about epidemics of issues in our country when it comes to society and the impacts that it has on, people from childhood through adulthood, and how it can be mitigated when it actually happens if you handle it well, which is sometimes the worst trauma sometimes isn't what actually happened to the children, but how the people they trusted even more to come to their aid didn't. And so it's a great organization. We've given over $60,000 to them since 2012, I believe. So I give up to $5,000 each year, as a part of that. And we're very proud that, that we get to do that, and of our readers to want to do that. So if you want to give to a good cause, go to ddl.org. If you want to give to a good cause and get a draft guide that is rooted in football, but also gives you fantasy focused stuff, because I also am a senior staff writer at FootballGuys.com. So I straddle both worlds, and I'd like to say I do it well enough that you can kind of get the value from both. You can get the rookie scouting portfolio at MattWaldman.com.
And Adam, by the time we have Matt back on to do some fantasy, we'll expect your beard to be a little larger. You're lacking a little bit in the beard
slipping.
We'll do that, and then I'll shave mine at that point once I get the rest of this weight off. So we'll go from there.
Matt, always appreciate it when you stop by the show. We appreciate you.
Hey, man, it's a big pleasure, guys. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks.